Our next guest this morning has served with distinction as Israel's ambassador to the United States since 2013. He joins us today to celebrate the 70-year alliance between America and Israel, and he will share with us his unique viewpoint on the opportunities and challenges facing the relationships in the years ahead. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ambassador Ron Dermer. Good morning. It's great to have you with us. I know it's a touch and go. Yeah, small crowd. So,
is that me or you?
it must be you because I'm okay, right?
There you go. Thank you.
What is this?
It's part of the show.
Yeah, we're just testing if you're already woken up.
It's your mic.
Always the press, right? It's always the press. I want to start, Ambassador, with remarks that you made here in last year's policy convention, and I want to quote. You said,
I'm glad people were paying attention to what I said at APEC.
the worst outcome that could emerge from the horrific carnage in Syria would be to effectively cede parts of Syria to Iran and Hezbollah. Well, unfortunately, in the past year, while defeating ISIS, this is exactly what happened. And Iran is expanding in the north of Israel. We just saw last month how a hostile drone drove over from Syria to Israel. So I think we all want to hear from you two things. A, how volatile is the situation right now in the north? And B, what can you tell us about Israel's strategy to counter Iran in Syria?
Well, the situation is very volatile because Iran continues on its mission essentially to establish permanent military bases in Syria, to establish another terror front to attack Israel from Syria, and also to build factories for precision-guided munitions in Syria and Lebanon. So they're continuing with their plans, and as committed as they are to advance those, Israel is even more committed to stopping them. And the Prime Minister has been very clear about his red lines in Syria, and unfortunately he's had to enforce those red lines repeatedly. You mentioned the drone strike, a brazen violation of Israel's sovereignty and security, where the Iranians sent a drone into our airspace. That drone was taken out. We also targeted a number of Iranian and Syrian positions within Syria, and in that flare-up, you also saw the downing of an Israeli jet, which is obviously a very serious thing. So we're going to continue to enforce our red lines, and I think what's important for people to understand is we're just not going to allow Iran to advance its aims in Syria. So the more the world backs Israel's right to defend itself and to enforce those red lines, the less likely you're going to see an escalation. It's clear that the United States supports Israel's policy. It's important for other countries around the world who do not want to see an escalation and do not want to see a wider war to back Israel. And I hope they do. But we're dead serious about enforcing our red lines in Syria, and I think if people haven't understood that up until this point, they'll understand it in the future.
Dead serious, you say. Let's stay with Iran and talk about the nuclear deal. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu was very clear. He said, fix it or nix it. What fixes do you believe need to be made, and can they actually be achieved in the timeline that we have now?
Well, first, let's understand what the problem is before we're going to fix it, because a lot of people forget. What the nuclear deal is essentially it puts us all on cruise control heading over a cliff. Because the restrictions that the deal puts in place are automatically removed in a few years. When the deal was signed, it was 10 to 15 years. Now it's 8 to 13 years. So Iran doesn't need to change its behavior at all. All they have to do is wait for the calendar to move. They can continue to be committed to Israel's destruction. They can continue to be the foremost sponsor of terrorism in the world. And at a date certain that is approaching, year after year, we're getting closer, all of these nuclear restrictions are removed. In addition to that, there is also something that I think is not understood by people. Iran is advancing its nuclear weapons program under this agreement. A lot of people think—
As we speak.
Yeah, as we speak. People think, well, at least we've frozen Iran's nuclear program, and then we'll have to deal with this issue in another decade. That's not true. Right now, as we speak, Iran is doing research and development on advanced centrifuges. One of the most remarkable sentences from this deal when it was signed was that over the next decade, Iran can only do R&D on the IR-2, 4, 6, and 8. Those are Iran's advanced centrifuges. That's like, that restriction is like saying that Apple, over the next decade, can only do R&D on the iPhone 11, 12, 13, and 14. So as we speak, Iran is actually developing more advanced centrifuges, which they will use to enrich uranium. In addition, Iran is also developing ballistic missiles. And that is how you would deliver a nuclear payload. And I have news, it's probably not news for an APAC audience, but Iran already has missiles that can hit Israel. So those missiles that they're developing are not for us. They're for all of Europe and ultimately for the United States. So Iran is advancing its nuclear weapons program now, under this agreement. So what do you do in order to fix it? The first thing you have to do is remove these sunset clauses. That was actually, those of you who remember that speech that Prime Minister Netanyahu gave in Congress 3 years ago, that was the main point of his speech, to not have these restrictions be automatically removed. So you have to address the issue of the sunset clause. The other thing that you need to do is make sure that these missiles are part of any agreement, or at least are addressed. So that would mean that if Iran continues to develop these missiles, that you'd have crippling sanctions on Iran. And what crippling sanctions mean are sanctions on oil and sanctions on the financial sector. Those were the sanctions that actually created a huge problem for Iran. So if Iran is going to continue to develop its missile program, we need to put those sanctions on. And the third thing is you have to deal with the inspection regime, because Iran has said that you cannot inspect military sites in Iran. Where do you think they're going to actually do the weaponization work and other parts of their program is there. So this is something that has to be, I think, surfaced. The most important thing, Donna, for the President of the United States, in order to get the changes that he wants, is for everyone else to believe that the President is actually prepared to walk away if he doesn't get those changes. And I have no doubt whatsoever that this President is prepared to walk away from the deal.
And I'm sure it's going to be in the center of the meeting tomorrow between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. But let's talk about the good news of this year, and that is, of course, the Jerusalem...
Who wants to hear good news?
I was going to talk about the Jerusalem Declaration. Don't we want to talk about that?
Yeah, how about that?
So, you said that it was a diplomatic victory that would advance peace. So please walk us through the significance of the Jerusalem Declaration, and how do you think it will advance peace? Or in other words, how do you get Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, back to the negotiating table with this declaration?
Well, to understand the significance, you have to appreciate, Donna, that the Jewish people remember the declaration of Cyrus from 2,500 years ago that allowed the Jews to go back and rebuild the Second Temple. Now, I don't know if the Persians remember Cyrus, but the Jewish people remember Cyrus. This decision will be remembered forever for the Jewish people. The fact that the leader of the free world, the most powerful country in the world, becomes the first leader to recognize Jerusalem as our capital is a decision that will never, ever be forgotten by the Jewish people. And yeah, and I hope and I expect that he won't be the last country to lead this effort, but I guess that remains to be seen. Now, as for why I think it advances peace, and I truly believe it advances peace, it depends on what you think the reason is why we don't have peace. If you believe the reason why we don't have peace is this or that final status issue, then I suppose you could have a different view. But the reason why I believe we don't have peace is really a first status issue, which is, do the Palestinians recognize the legitimacy, the right of a Jewish people to a state in any boundary in our historic homeland? Yes or no? Unfortunately, for the last century, the answer has been no. They have refused to recognize our legitimacy. They may understand that we're there by might, but not by right. If we're going to advance peace, they have to understand that we are here by right. And they're not prepared to do that yet, and they engage in a constant effort to delegitimize Israel. And nowhere is that delegitimization stronger than when it comes to Jerusalem. There's a reason why Arafat said to Bill Clinton, there was never a temple on the Temple Mount. There's a reason why Abu Mazen refuses to talk about a connection between the Jewish people and Jerusalem. Because if they recognize this historical connection, it means that the Jewish people are in our homeland by right and not simply by might. And President Trump, in making this decision, punctures this great lie that the Jewish people are foreign colonialists in the land of Israel. That's why I think it's the beginning of a path to peace.
Let's stay in Jerusalem for another quick question. Last summer, there was controversy when a compromise over egalitarian prayer in the Western Wall was suspended. In the wake of that controversy, how did you see it affect, if at all, the relationship between Israel and the American Jewish community, and what is the way forward?
Well, I think that for people in the United States who are focused on this issue, this is an important issue, and they'd like to see it move forward. I think there's going to be good news in the next year, actually. I'm glad you say that the decision was suspended, because a lot of people think the decision was canceling it. It wasn't the cancellation decision, it was suspended. And what the Prime Minister is trying to do now is to advance the practical components of this agreement. And what do I mean by practical components? The specific charge that the Supreme Court gave Israel was to make sure that there would be a makom ra'ui, a appropriate space for egalitarian prayer. There is a space today. A lot of people don't know that. There are bar mitzvahs that happen there all the time.
I had my son's bar mitzvah there.
There you go. I didn't know that. But it happens all the time. You could have a dozen bar mitzvahs in a single day at this egalitarian prayer space, but it is not the same as the prayer space next to it. It has to be built out. They have to deal with more hours. It has to be suitable. And that process will, I think, move forward actually quite rapidly. Then there are some ideological issues, sort of governance of the site. The original decision had a role for non-Orthodox streams there. And second is a common entrance. And I think those issues have to be addressed, and we have to find creative solutions to keep moving this process forward. But I think if we're both sitting here next year, I think that we'll be able to report on the good news that happened and not on the good news that will come.
So it's good that we could end with the good news. Ambassador Ron Dermer, thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're very busy with the Prime Minister.
Thank you.
And thank you.